Hare Krishna and welcome. I'm Kormadas and I'm speaking to you today from Sage Cottage, County Wicklow, Republic of Ireland. Today I'm going to be reading from my book, The Great Transcendental Adventure Pastimes of His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada, in Australia and New Zealand. And this is episode number 11. Where we are at the moment is we are reading from chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called The Great Transcendental Adventure Part 1, and we are situated in Sydney, and the year is 1972. We are going to be reading from some of the wonderful adventures of His Divine Grace as he spread the Krishna consciousness movement throughout the Western world and beyond. This is Saturday, the 8th of April, 1972. Srila Prabhupada is in Melbourne, as I said, and he just the night before attended the Melbourne Town Hall to a resounding reception of 2,000 people. Saturday, 8th of April, 1972. After breakfast, Srila Prabhupada outlined his travel plans in a letter to Guru Das in Vrindavan. I'm very happy, he wrote, with our Australian programs. And in a few days, we are flying to New Zealand, where Tusta Krishna has opened a new ISKCON centre. Then we shall go to Hong Kong and Japan. So you may reply to me at the Sydney address until the 18th of April, 1972, at Tokyo from the 18th to the 1st of May, and after that, care of Los Angeles. Prabhupada was always meticulous in his letter writing and his planning, travel plans. And of course, in those days, there was no email, there were no text messages, but everything went on. Keep me informed, he wrote, very regularly, all that is happening, especially with the Vrindavan scheme. Prabhupada was in Australia, but he was meditating on the Krishna Balaram temple, which had not yet been opened. Prabhupada was encouraging and affectionate in his dealings with Deepak, who now served as Melbourne's full-time pujari, Melbourne Temple. Deepak, in turn, reciprocated by trying to render menial service. He was in the habit of daily bringing Srila Prabhupada offered articles from the morning deity worship, garlands, tulsi leaves, and other sacred articles. Deepak often marveled at the depths of Srila Prabhupada's spiritual emotions. The day before, as he sat beside him in the car, Prabhupada suddenly started laughing. Turning to Deepak, he said, "Do you know what this name Deepak means?" Deepak, bewildered by the sudden manifestation of Prabhupada's mirth, could not answer. "It means to enlighten, said Srila Prabhupada, to bring light into darkness." Prabhupada laughed some more, leaving Deepak to wonder further at the cause. Now Deepak came with some questions. He wondered what food preparations should be cooked for the deities, when they should be offered. Prabhupada answered at length, specifying types of food that Krishna liked to eat at various times of the day. Deepak had a couple of other more personal questions. "Srila Prabhupada," he asked nervously, "could you give me the secret to spiritual advancement?" Deepak was hoping for a mystical, esoteric answer. "Yes," replied Prabhupada gravely. "Chant the holy names 16 rounds every day. Never stop chanting, and you are guaranteed spiritual advancement." Deepak had one more question. "Srila Prabhupada, what can I do for you?" Prabhupada's answer was completely satisfying. "Your service attitude," he said, "is enough." So Prabhupada was always encouraging his disciples. And a wonderful, loving exchange was going on between Prabhupada and his disciples, as in the example of Jagatarini. We'll tell you about that now. Deepak was not alone in experiencing first-hand Srila Prabhupada's courteous gratitude for his disciples' humble service. Once, Srila Prabhupada had asked Nandakumar to go see who was singing in the temple, and his servant told him it was Krishna Premi. "She sings very nicely," he had said with a smile. Jagatarini also noted how Prabhupada was always thankful for even the simplest of offerings. When she had polished and restrung Srila Prabhupada's heavy brass kartals and sewn a new bag for them, Prabhupada had graciously accepted them, expressing genuine appreciation. "Oh, thank you very much," he said. And he had even complimented her on her sari. Prabhupada had a very wonderful relationship with his lady disciples. That day, Jagatarini got the opportunity to introduce her parents to Srila Prabhupada in the quiet of his room. Prabhupada reclined on one arm of his chaise longue as Jagatarini's parents sat comfortably before him. Prabhupada glanced down at Jagatarini sitting cross-legged on the Belgian-style rug. "So," he asked, "this is your father and mother?" Jagatarini looked up. "Yes, Srila Prabhupada." Prabhupada smiled at her father. "So, your daughter will deliver you." The man was a little flustered. "Oh yes, we always knew she'd do something like that," he said. Prabhupada paused, his face expressing both concern and compassion. "Don't think that she's given up your service," he said. "She's doing the highest service. Because of her, so many generations back and so many forward will be liberated." The couple listened attentively as Prabhupada described how, wherever he went throughout the world, parents would come and thank him for the positive changes that he had brought about in their children's lives. At the end of the meeting, Prabhupada took off his fragrant garland and indicated to Shyama Sundara to give it to Jagatarini's mother, who was thrilled to receive the gift. Jagatarini told me that Mrs. Walmsley, the mother of Jagatarini, was so thrilled with receiving that garland from Prabhupada that she kept it at home for a very long time, for like years, until it was just one dried skeleton of a garland, but she particularly worshipped it. So she was very impressed by Prabhupada's graciousness. In the afternoon, Srila Prabhupada returned to Sydney to stay for a few days before his onward flight to New Zealand. Touching down at Sydney's Kingsford Smith Airport, Prabhupada and his entourage quickly crossed the tarmac. In those days, you would often walk across the tarmac to get to the either wherever you were getting to, another plane or onto the plane or off the plane. There's a nice picture of this where Prabhupada's walking across the tarmac. It's just been raining and he's holding up his dhoti a little bit so it doesn't get wet. Prabhupada and his entourage quickly crossed the tarmac. A group of devotees received Prabhupada respectfully at the terminal door, and soon he was en route to the temple. Since Mohanananda's phone call a few days before, there was a phone call, and Sydney and Melbourne were competing who had the nicest temple, who could please Srila Prabhupada the most with their temple. So that conversation had got on before. Mohanananda had so this was in Sydney. So he had phoned Melbourne and told them of Prabhupada's decisions about who had the nicest temple. Since Mohanananda's phone call a few days before, the Sydney devotees had been immersed in a blissful fever of Transcendental temple refurbishment. The somewhat run-down house in Glebe now had banana palms growing in the front garden. Miraculous. They'd only grown up in a few days. Actually, we had purchased them, of course, and planted them there. They grow quite nicely in Sydney. It was warm enough. The temple windows were now bordered with gold lattice work. Indian-style gold-painted wooden fretwork arches bordered the veranda, and the creaky iron gate had been oiled. Good move. As Prabhupada walked in the front gate, he appeared very happy with the improvements. Those that he seemed not to notice were quickly pointed out to him, and the devotees were ready for Srila Prabhupada this time, his first time in this particular tour. He had taken a taxi to the temple because no one was there at the airport to pick him up. We were a befuddled bunch. So this time, the devotees were ready. In the hallway before Prabhupada entered the temple room, one young brahmachari bathed Prabhupada's feet with warm water, mixed with fragrant rose petals. When Prabhupada entered the temple room, he saw it had been transformed. Vaibhavi Devidasi, the wife of Charu Prabhu, had spent long sleepless hours on a scaffold brushing gold over the embossed plaster patterns on the temple ceiling. It was a little bit like Leonardo da Vinci. Was it Leonardo or was it his friend? I can't remember. But anyway, in the Sistine Chapel, maybe I'm getting my personalities mixed up, but you know who I mean. So she was up there on a scaffold, lying down with gold leaf, embossing the rosettes on the ceiling. And the result was quite impressive. Someone also pointed out to him the multicolored ceiling rosette. Now, in Sydney architecture in the 70s was reminiscent of a previous age where they took a lot of care to build nice houses. And it wasn't just lumps of plaster, but it was all nicely embossed. And so there was facility for making houses look very pretty. The labor of love was well worth it, and the result was impressive. Someone also pointed out to him the multicolored ceiling rosette surrounding a new chandelier. So we had nice new chandeliers and a matching chandelier in the deity room. The devotees had painted the skirting board and walls gold. The Hare Krishna mantra in bold red Sanskrit lettering that Vaibhavi had written up now adorned the area above the arched wall dividing the deity room and the temple. Many new posters with gold-painted frames now decorated the temple walls. Well, we had a marathon. Prabhupada nodded with satisfaction at all the improvements, and seeing this, all the devotees felt their hard work had been well worthwhile. As it is said that Yasya prasadat bhagavat prasado, yasya prasadan nagati kutopi. One, by worshipping the spiritual master and glorifying the spiritual master, one actually glorifies Krishna. It is actually a fact that there is no difference between pleasing Krishna and pleasing the spiritual master, and by pleasing the spiritual master, Krishna is pleased. Sunday, the 9th of April, 1972. This was next day. Since the temple could not afford a separate car, we were as poor as church mice, as they say, Prabhupada travelled to Centennial Park, the famous Centennial Park, for his morning walk in the front passenger seat of the Volkswagen van. It was a sky blue Volkswagen van with no windows in the back. And it was a huge step up. Devotees had to actually lift Prabhupada up to get into that front passenger seat. It was too high for him to step up. But it worked okay. And those devotees that were fortunate enough to squeeze in the back, who were invited on the morning walk, were quite happy to be there, because you could squeeze quite a few people in that back part of the van. Sitting on the floor, they felt privileged and ecstatic to be so close to their spiritual master. Amoga Das recalls, when Srila Prabhupada got aboard the blue combi van to go for the morning walk, I sat in the back on the floor, there were no seats at the back, behind the gear shift and two front seats. to be close to him. He put his cane between the seats and moved it around, trying to find a resting place. I put my hand out and held the cane. Then he let go. This became my daily little service. I would jump in the back of the combi van and sit down to hold Prabhupada's cane. End of recollection by Amoga. Late in the afternoon, Srila Prabhupada and his party drove to the temple for the initiation ceremony. So Prabhupada was staying in a separate accommodation, and he drove to the temple because there was no place for him to stay in the temple. It was too tiny. Although the weather was unseasonably warm and humid, this is Sydney after all, Prabhupada wore a light orange sweater under his shiny saffron top piece. So even though it was warm for Sydney standards, probably for Prabhupada's standards, it was still cool enough for him to wear a sweater. Like recently, it's been like 50 degrees in India. Well, it certainly wasn't that warm. The devotees had set up a small, low stage in the corner of the yard. We had a very big backyard because it used to be a stables, and they used to keep horses. So there was a big area, and we had and a tennis court also. So quite a lot of space. There in the front of a backdrop of palm fronds, they had placed Srila Prabhupada's Vyasasana under a simple yellow cloth canopy, adorned with garlands of marigolds. Over 100 guests were already assembled in the backyard when Prabhupada arrived. So this was a Sunday feast time. So they had overlapped both programs, Sunday feast and initiations. Very special day. So yes, a very special day. Devotees waiting for initiation, and there were over a dozen of them, if I recall, sat expectantly, as you do at initiation time, near the small fire pit in front of the stage. Most of the 15 boys and girls sitting before him had been devotees for only 2 months, some less. Because Prabhupada only came to Australia once a year, sometimes Prabhupada would be, just like in the case of my initiation, I had been in the temple for 4 weeks. So Prabhupada just took the plunge and took risks and initiated people who had been recommended. Otherwise, they would have to wait another year. Some less than 2 months. In this case, once again, Prabhupada had shown his mercy, deciding to initiate most of the new devotees in the temple. The sky was overcast. I remember this afternoon very well, and there were cicadas making their special sound as the sun went down, and there was the aroma of frangipani. I can still remember the smells and the sights and the sounds, even though this was 50 years ago. The sun sank low, and the sound of crickets, okay, they weren't cicadas, they were crickets, but you know the sound, became prominent. Soft breezes carried the sweet scent of a nearby fully laden frangipani tree. Prabhupada propped his walking stick against the palm fronds and quickly mounted the raised seat. He began the proceedings by softly chanting, strand by strand, on the new initiate's beads that hung over the right side of the asana. Sometimes Prabhupada would chant on initiate's beads in his room a day or two before. But at this particular period, and this happened at other places in those early days, Prabhupada would actually chant on the devotees' beads in situ, in real time. So if there were a dozen or 15 devotees getting initiated, it would take 2 hours. It would take the same amount of time as you would take to chant 16 rounds, just in between, just adding all that time on to the actual proceedings of the initiation. So it was a very substantial event, time-wise. As he finished each round, he called the devotee forward. Arthur was first to come up, my old friend Bhakta Arthur. back to Arthur and me, had an interesting history, which is beyond the scope of this recording. Arthur was first to come up. Arthur used to be a boxer at the Sydney Leagues Club. And those of you from Australia will know the Sydney Leagues Club. So Arthur was the first to come up. Ever since his initial eye contact with Prabhupada on his arrival day in Paddington 1 year before, Arthur had found himself drawn to Krishna consciousness. Now a full-time brahmachari, he was eager to be accepted as Prabhupada's disciple. Prabhupada handed Arthur his beads. "Your name is Ajamila Dasa," he said, and proceeded to tell the story of the original Ajamil. Ajamil, he said, was a great sinner. Some devotees glanced nervously at each other, wide-eyed with astonishment. Why was Prabhupada naming Arthur after a great sinner? They thought. But as they continued to listen, their ignorance was dispelled. In his youth, Prabhupada explained, Ajamila had been a dutiful brahmana, but later he had given up his strict life and become involved in debauchery. He had, however, named his son Narayana, a name of God, and at the time of his death, as he helplessly called out for his son, the original Narayana, Krishna, took notice and saved him from the hellish destination that awaited him. Prabhupada pointed out the modern-day relevance of the story. So, those who are always chanting the holy name of God, they are in a safe position. Safe position means next life, he's going back to home, back to Godhead. So this is an example, Prabhupada said, that such a sinful man, if simply by chanting once at the time of his death, he could get so much benefit, then what to speak of those who are chanting always the holy name of God? They should be always in the safe condition. Maya, or the material contamination, cannot touch them. Of course, this lecture was recorded, and so we're very benefited to have this whole transcribed initiation lecture. Prabhupada added a note of caution. But one thing, Prabhupada said, those who are being initiated today, they are being freed from the resultant action of past sinful life, but they should be very careful not to again commit sinful activities. End of quote. Next, Prabhupada called Simon to the dais. Now, Simon had come up from Melbourne for this event. Simon was a regular devotee in the Melbourne temple. In fact, devotees had come from all over Australia for this initiation. Not all over, but Simon came to the dais and Prabhupada gave Simon the name Shyamananda Das. There's a few Shyamanandas in ISKCON these days. Prabhupada gave that name to a few people. This was Bhakta Simon, who was an artist at the time and still is a well-known artist in Australia. Shyamananda. So Prabhupada said, Shyamananda. Shyama means Krishna. Shyama Sundaram. So one who takes pleasure in serving Krishna, his name is Shyam Ananda. Ananda means pleasure. We take pleasure in serving so many nonsense things. Sometimes we take pleasure in serving a dog. But the same service attitude, when transferred to Krishna, makes our life successful. Everyone is giving service. Somebody is giving service to a country. Someone is giving service to his society, to his wife, to his children. And if he has nothing to serve, then he keeps a pet dog just to give it service. So service we must give. This is our constitutional position. But that service is meant for rendering to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So long as we remain forgetful where our service should be given, that is called material life. When we come to that consciousness that I have to serve Krishna, that is spiritual life. That is the difference between material life and spiritual life. Well, that's a great definition. We are serving. There is no doubt. We cannot be master. And any one of you who are present today in this meeting, none of you can say that I am the master. Every one of you is a servant to somebody. That is our position. But that service is being rendered in mistaken places. Therefore, we are not happy. Neither is the person whom we are serving happy. This is the position. But as soon as you serve Krishna, Shama Sundara, then you become happy. The whole world becomes happy. This is a great science. Try to understand. Hari was next. Bhakta Hari. After he promised to chant 16 rounds a day and follow the 4 regulative principles, Prabhupada gave Hari his beads and his new name. So he said, your name is Hari Sauri. Sauri means learned scholar, and Hari means the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is the same Hari Sauri Prabhu who wrote also many books like this one about Srila Prabhupada. The famous Prabhupada's Diary, 5 volumes, if I recall, written by Hari Sauri. One who is a learned scholar in the science of Krishna. That's the meaning of Hari Sauri. It is a great science, Krishna consciousness. We don't take it very insignificantly. And Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says anyone who knows this science, he becomes spiritual master. It doesn't matter what he is. He has actually said, Kiba Shudra, Kiba Vipranyasi Keninai, Ye Krishna Tattva Vetta Sei Guru Hai. Kiba Shudra. Shudra is considered to be a lowest in the civilized society. Shudra means lower class, working class, no intelligence. And Vipra means Brahmana, the most intelligent class of the human society. So either one is a Shudra or a Vipra, similarly born in a Vipra family. Kibba Vipra Nyasi Kene. Nyasi means sannyasi. Sannyasa order is the topmost order in the social division. So, whatever he may be, in other words, if he's a Shudra, if he's a Vipra, it doesn't matter. If he knows the science of Krishna, he becomes a spiritual master. So Sauri means one who is learned. Hari Sauri means one who is learned in the science of Krishna. So, he said to Hari Sauri, just try to be a learned scholar in Krishna science and deliver the whole world. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Next man, come on. The initiations continued. There were 2 Rays. I remember them both. One became Rajgana, and yes, I remember Rajgana. Rajgana passed away some years back, actually. One who is classified amongst the kings, Rajgana, and the other became Rajendra, a name of Maharaj Parikshit. Prabhupada told him, try to become like Maharaj Parikshit. Dev received the name Dvaipayana, Bhakta Dev. And Des became Durvasa Muni. Wali was called to the dais. Although generally Prabhupada insisted that all his disciples be clean-shaven, in this case he had made an exception. Wali's hair reached his shoulders. Wali was a professor. As Wali came up to take his beads, Prabhupada smiled. Vyasadeva had long hairs and beard also. As the devotees laughed, he said good-humouredly, but he is without beard. Shyamasundara added, he is a professor also. Oh, said Prabhupada, and Vyasadeva is the greatest professor. He is the authority of Vedic literature. All right, very good name, he said, Vyasadeva Das. To become the servant of the greatest authority of Vedic literature. Thank you. Now it was time for the ladies. Wali's wife, Kerry, stood and self-consciously approached Srila Prabhupada. She had been having difficulties in accepting all the tenets of Krishna consciousness and had not felt comfortable in devotional attire. That afternoon, however, the girls had helped her put on a new sari and had tied her hair back in the proper Vedic manner. Prabhupada was very encouraging. Now, he said, with this dress, you look so beautiful. This Vedic dress is also nice, very beautiful. It increases the beauty 100 times. So you know the rules and regulations? Kari replied, yes. So, he said, chant with your husband. That's all. Thank you. Your name is Kalki Devidasi. Kalki is the last incarnation of Krishna. So Kalki is incarnation of Krishna, and that means you are a servant of, a maid servant of Krishna. Anne received the name Ambika. Ambika Devidasi, my god sister. She's living in northern New South Wales. Still going strong. So Ambika is another name of goddess Durga, the material nature. Prabhupada told her, material nature is also another energy of Krishna, God. So to become her maidservant means she will help you approach Krishna. Thank you. Prabhupada concluded the name-giving ceremony. Phil became Partha. Stanley became Sahadeva. Sahadeva's there living in Mayapur, if I recall, to this very day. And Jeff became Nakula. Nakula passed away at least 20 years ago. Nakula Das. So Sahadev and Nakula were initiated together. Stanley and Jeff, Sahadev and Nakula, two of the 5 Pandava brothers. Our names are so many, Prabhupada said, but the real name is Das, servant. Our position is servant of the servant of the servant. We don't want to become the master. Our position is servant of the servant. Gopi Bhartu Padakamalayo Dasa Dasa Nudasaha. The more we become servant of the servant, the more we become advanced. It is very difficult to understand from a material standpoint. Here everyone wants to become a master of the master. In spiritual life, they want to become servant of the servant. That is a bigger position. So as we make advancement in spiritual life, we understand this. Very profound. 3 marriages were to be solemnized that day. Prabhupada told the couples sitting before them, I'm just looking down the page here, I can't remember who they were. Anyway, if you're out there, you'll know. 3 marriages were to be solemnized that day. Prabhupada told the couples sitting before him that the purpose of Krishna consciousness, Krishna conscious marriage, was to produce God-conscious children. He explained that at present, because people did not know the science of Krishna, how to do this, there was no peace in the world. In other words, people would just produce children without knowing how to produce a good child. Otherwise, you produce all sorts of, how would you say, unwanted children. Just like I was reading in the news this morning, somebody walked into a preschool in Texas and shot dead 19 little children. That's America for you. So how do you produce a child that goes on, and he was a teenager himself. He produced a child that ends up slaughtering a whole classroom full of children. The world is unfortunately going to hell because people don't know the science behind conception of children. It's a very serious business. At present, Prabhupada said, because people don't know the science of how to do this, there is no peace in the world. But if there are Krishna conscious children, they will grow up and they will possess all good qualities. So peace automatically will come if people become Krishna conscious, because they become highly qualified without committing any sinful activities. If such population is there in the world, there is no question of disturbance, Prabhupada said. Everyone will be peaceful and happy. So our Krishna consciousness institution encourages marriages on this ground, not to produce cats and dogs, but to produce highly qualified devotees. Prabhupada once again stressed as he almost always did at marriage ceremonies, that Krishna conscious marriage also meant no divorce under any circumstances. Prabhupada reiterated the same examples from Chanakya Pandit as he explained to Jagatarini a week or two before his arrival. So you have got experience at rumbling early in the morning. He was talking about the clouds. When you get up in the morning and you hear rumbling clouds in the sky. This means that there will not be a heavy shower of rain, he said. Rumbling of clouds in the morning means no rain. There may be very great rumbling, but the result is very small, maybe some drizzling. Similarly, a husband and a wife may fight, but if you don't give them any seriousness, they will mitigate. In other words, it sounds very serious. You hear plates smashing and doors slamming, but things will go on. That is the process. But in the Western countries, in the name of liberty, so many family lives are dismantled simply by this divorce case. In other words, Prabhupada was saying, you just have to tolerate, but don't take it seriously. So according to Vedic civilization, there is no divorce. Once united, it cannot be disunited in any condition of life that you should follow. Prabhupada told us this again and again and again. Mohanananda Das lit the sacrificial fire. It was a beautiful outdoor fire in the backyard with the fragrance of the frangipani trees, the crickets chirping and the soft breezes, warm breezes, and the sun had dipped down below the horizon. I remember it very well. Prabhupada returned to his flat after the ceremony while the devotees and guests shared a sumptuous feast of Krishna Prasadam. Monday, 10th of April, 1972. What were you doing in 1972? Some of you, of course, were enjoying your previous life, and some of you were starting off this one. I was 20 at this time. Although staying in Paddington, Prabhupada requested a simple room equipped with a desk and a bed, and in the house adjoining the temple. Oh yes. So Prabhupada was staying in Paddington, but he requested that in the house next door, the temple, they set up an arrangement there where he could do things during the day. So in the house next door to the temple, which was being rented by devotees, Prabhupada requested a room there, a simple room with a desk and a bed for him to have an afternoon rest if he needed, so that he could then conveniently speak to the devotees without having to go all the way back to Paddington. So in the afternoon, Srila Prabhupada called Simon, now Shyamananda, into his room. Shyamananda was finding the Sydney temple a vital creative environment and eagerly sat and listened as Prabhupada, seated behind his simple low desk, spoke to him enthusiastically of Vedic architecture, temple design, town planning, and music. Prabhupada was presenting the cultural aspects of Krishna consciousness. Seeing that Shyamananda had brought his sketchbook and was eager to reciprocate, Prabhupada indicated for him to come closer. Shyamananda moved a few feet forward. "No," he said, "come this side," Prabhupada said, and sat him down next to him. The senior men in the room were surprised at Prabhupada's intimate dealings with this young man. They rarely had such an opportunity for such a close rapport. Prabhupada continued discussing with Shyamananda for some time, giving more details of the Vrindavan land, because we were talking about opening the Krishna Balaram temple in Vrindavan, and Prabhupada had asked Shyamananda if he could design a temple. We ended up not using Shyamananda's plans, but nevertheless, this service had been given to Shyamananda at the time. So Prabhupada discussed the shape of the block, the temple requirements, and at one stage, Prabhupada handed Shyamananda a photo of the Radha Damodar temple and pointed out a few architectural features that he hoped to see incorporated in the new temple design. Srila Prabhupada's encouraging and considerate attention increased Shyamananda's enthusiasm for the project. He marveled at Prabhupada's expertise. Rather than limiting his creative potential, he felt Prabhupada was expertly drawing out his very best for Krishna's service. The meeting ended on a disturbing note, however. Prabhupada rose, stood up, and walked over to his bed, preparing to take an afternoon rest. Pulling back the sheets, he looked down, and then he turned to Mohanananda. "What is this?" he asked, suddenly, pointing. Mohanananda and Shyamananda, or should I say Shyamasundara, there was Shyamananda and Shyamasundara were there, looked with shocked disbelief. Lying ominously on the bed were a number of thumbtacks, points up. Mohanananda was practically lost for words. They're thumbtacks, Srila Prabhupada. "I know they're thumbtacks," Prabhupada was almost yelling. "How did they get here?" No one could answer. Prabhupada was furious. "These thumbtacks do not have legs. How did they get here?" The devotees, speechless and mortified, could only allow themselves to think that perhaps the tacks had been left there accidentally. But it seemed Prabhupada had another idea. He looked straight at Mohanananda. "Who is trying to do this to me?" he asked. The devotees were unable to offer any answer. After a few more tense moments, the tacks were removed and Prabhupada lay down, pulling the sheet over himself. Still visibly shocked, the devotees excused themselves and left the room. Yes, quite a shocking story. Now, it's interesting because I remember interviewing Shyamananda, Bhakta Simon, the artist, and he told me this story. And when you're researching history, and the science is called oral history, because I interviewed over 250 devotees from this period, and I got 900 hours of interview material. And when I interviewed Shyamananda, I thought to myself, this story is, it's heavy, it's very disturbing, and I was thinking, should I put this story in the book, and how can I confirm that this actually happened? When you're an interviewer, when you're a researcher, when you're producing oral history, you need to verify, always verify the facts. So I was thinking, this story, I will put this story in the book if I can verify the story. Now, up to this point, my dealings with Shyamananda were that he was a very reliable. He had a very reliable memory. Because he told me many stories that were confirmed by other people. So I was thinking, okay, Shyamananda he's a reputable source of information, because I remember once I interviewed somebody and they said, "Oh, Prabhupada was cold and I gave him my jumper." And I was thinking, oh, isn't that nice? Prabhupada was cold and you gave Prabhupada your jumper. And then he came back to me later and he said, "Oh, actually, I'm sorry." He said, "That was a dream." Yes, so you do have to be careful. So anyway, I wanted to verify the story. Now, I was in America at the time when I was doing this particular stage of my research. So I thought to myself, okay, I've got to get in contact with Mohanananda. Now, at that stage, no one knew where Mohanananda was living at the time. I'm talking about in the 1990s when I was writing this book. So I thought, well, how can I verify this story? I spoke to Shyamasundara on the phone. I tried to speak to Shyamasundara on the phone about this, but he was unavailable. And then I thought, well, who else was there? Mohanananda was there, Shyamasundara was there, Shyamananda was there. What am I going to do? And then someone said, well, maybe you could speak to Shasti, because Shasti was Mohanananda's wife at the time, and she was also in Sydney. I think she was pregnant at the time. And so I was thinking, okay, I better speak to Shasti. Now, Shasti, I found, was living in Oregon. And so I got Shasti's number and I said, And I was speaking to her and I said, look, I've got this story. I wondered if you could help me. I can't get in touch with Mohanananda because I don't know where he is. And she said, I don't know where he is either. I said, do you remember the story about the thumbtacks? And she said, I certainly do. She said, I remember Mohanananda came home from the temple and he told me the story of the thumbtacks. And he said Prabhupada was very angry. So there we have it. So the story was verified. And it's very important when you're writing history that you have to verify. Always verify, verify, verify. That's the motto. So this is probably one of the heaviest stories that I've ever heard. And but I thought, let me put it in the book because it happened. Tuesday, the 11th of April, 1972. Early rumblings of future prosecutions by city councils in Australia became evident in a news clipping sent out to Srila Prabhupada from Melbourne. So we're talking about Melbourne City Council, Sydney City Council, the police starting to become ruffled and agitated by chanting and book distribution in Australia. It became a whole worldwide phenomena. The article in the Melbourne Sun was titled Council Acts on Krishna 8. The report was that the Melbourne City Council planned to prosecute about 8 members of the Hare Krishna movement. Quote from the Sun, they will be summoned for an alleged break of a bylaw which prohibits asking for money on city streets without a permit. The acting town clerk, Mr. F.H. Hurd, said the council had given the sect a pretty fair spin. And if you don't speak Australian, that means they were very tolerant and they had let them do whatever they thought they should do, up to a point. So in Australia, that's called we gave them a pretty fair spin. But these people are now doing every day what accredited charitable organisations are each allowed to do one day in a year. Mr. Hurd said, 19 organisations were authorised to collect in city streets. Hare Krishna was not one of them, he said. He said that apart from being unfair to authorised collectors, the group's methods caused pedestrian congestion. Just before Easter, they followed the crowds, he said. This is what precipitated our action. He said council bylaws had booked many Hare Krishna members. Prosecution will begin in about a dozen cases, he said. Several members of the sect had their names taken more than once, including mine. While in Sydney in 1972, Prabhupada worked steadily on his purports to the later chapters of the Srimad Bhagavatam 3rd Canto. He was disappointed, however, that his disciples at ISKCON Press could not keep up with him and had admonished them accordingly. Consequently, when a special gold-bound edition of the 3rd Canto, Volume 1, arrived that afternoon by overseas express mail from the printers, Prabhupada was very happy. Each time one of Prabhupada's books were published, they would prepare one book which had gold along the spine, or I guess that's the spine, but the part of the book opposite the spine, the part when you close the book and there's all the pages, that was gold embossed, and the top and the bottom. So it was a special hand-bound edition of the book, which they would send to Prabhupada, beautifully done with gold embossing. So Prabhupada was in Sydney. He received this book in the mail. Consequently, when a special gold-bound edition of the 3rd Canto, Volume 1, arrived that afternoon by overseas express mail from the printers, Prabhupada was very happy. Sitting at his desk in the small room next door to the temple, he opened his glasses case and put on his dark-rimmed spectacles. And when Prabhupada would look very studious, like an ancient sage, when he put on his dark-rimmed spectacles, and he would wear them on his nose like this, especially when he was looking down. When one of my books is published, Prabhupada had said, I feel like I have conquered an empire. Prabhupada had also described his books as, quote, the most enduring glorification of Krishna and the most powerful propaganda for spreading Krishna's teachings throughout the world. Far from being the speculations of an ordinary conditioned soul subject to mistakes and cheating, these books contained the teachings and activities of Lord Krishna, the science of Krishna consciousness, passed down by the great acharyas. They were books of perfect knowledge. Srila Prabhupada held the book in his hands, examining the binding. On the cover, now this was one of the early editions of the third canto, and if you're an older devotee listening or observing this video, you may remember the first printing of the third canto. It was a bluish front cover with Krishna dancing on the heads of the Kaliya serpent on the front cover. Very nice. Prabhupada slowly turned the pages, examining the quality of the paper and the colour reproductions, reading small excerpts and smiling with pleasure. It was all first class. When Prabhupada turned to the back cover, however, his face became serious. Lord Brahma was depicted sitting on a red lotus flower. Do you remember that picture? It did not appear in subsequent editions. Lord Brahma was depicted sitting on a red lotus flower high above Lord Vishnu, who reclined majestically on a gigantic white serpentine bedstead of Sheshanaga as the Gaba ocean swirled all around. Very imaginative, very nicely done, apparently, painting. To Prabhupada, however, there was an obvious discrepancy. The artist had painted the subjects from above, and Prabhupada immediately pointed out the mistake. "What is this?" he said quizzically, now looking through the very bottom part of his spectacles as they sat low on his nose. "Helicopter view?" Prabhupada paused and looked around at the 2 or 3 devotees seated in his room. Who can be above Lord Vishnu? He had pinpointed a faulty mentality in the artist that others less astute would probably not have noticed. The artist had inappropriately depicted the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Vishnu, and the topmost living being of the universe, Lord Brahma, from above, a position unattainable for anyone in the creation. Helicopter view. It didn't happen often, but sometimes Srila Prabhupada was overcome by ecstatic emotions while lecturing. It had happened in the San Francisco storefront in the early days when Prabhupada was describing Lord Chaitanya's mood of separation from Krishna. It had also happened in Gorakhpur, India, while Prabhupada was seated before the deities of Radha Madhava discussing Krishna's pastimes. And it also happened in Mayapur at the 1974 Mayapur festival. Prabhupada was speaking and then he became silent. And the whole room became silent and we didn't know what to do. Prabhupada went into a trance. And we were sitting there for 3 minutes. There was 1,000 devotees in the room, but it was completely quiet. Until Hamsaduta decided to lead a kirtan. We weren't sure what to do. He thought it was appropriate to start chanting. Some of us thought that it was not appropriate of him to interrupt the mood, but anyway, he started chanting. And then Prabhupada came out of his trance, and then he spoke. He said, "Thank you very much." And then he stood up and left the temple room. So it happened very rarely, but there were 3 occasions that it happened. In Gorakhpur, in San Francisco, and in Mayapur. Now it happened in the tiny temple room in Sydney, before the deities of Radha Gopinath. Not long into the lecture, Prabhupada, while speaking about the mercy of Lord Chaitanya and Lord Nityananda, was unable to continue speaking. He paused as if stunned, and a very perceivable change in his consciousness took place. Then, trying as he did with great effort to restrain himself, he shed tears visibly before the silent temple room. We were all silent, as you'd expect. After a few moments, he gathered his emotions and said, "Thank you very much," thus ending the class. The kirtan began, and Srila Prabhupada quickly left the temple and returned to his house. Wednesday, the 12th of April, 1972. Now, this was a recollection from myself. I didn't interview myself, but this is something I added to the book because I remember it very well, and so do many others. Although originally their diet had been simple, we certainly did have a very simple diet. I was a very skinny boy in those days. When you see photographs of myself, you would not recognize me. It had lately become a habit, though, with the cooks in Sydney to prepare something new and exciting for the devotees' lunch. As well as the standard dal and rice, the ladies now cooked bread buns, different types of vegetable dishes, and huge cookies with thick, sweet icing. We used to call them sugar cookies. They became very popular in ISKCON, with the stress on the word sugar. But the most radical introduction had been the brahmachari offering. We used to call it the brahmachari offering for all the hungry brahmacharis. Since somehow or other the devotees could not hold out until hot milk at night, because we used to have a very light breakfast. I remember in Sydney we used to have semolina, or farina for you American viewers. Semolina boiled in water with lots of sugar, and it was flavored with exotic things like orange peel. When we really got adventurous, someone would grate up half an orange and put it in. So that was breakfast, and the Mahaprasadam was like two Simply Wonderfuls that was divided up between 40 devotees. And someone would come around with the Simply Wonderful, and they'd pinch off a little bit of Simply Wonderful, and it would drop out of the person's hand into your bowl of semolina. And the trick was to catch it before it melted into the cereal so you can get some taste from it. So that was breakfast, and then lunch was simple dal, rice, and chapatis. So then now for lunch, devotees had thought to add bread buns, and I remember someone used to make bread, but it was like rock. It was like bricks, and there were big cookies, I remember. So we were starting to get very hungry, and we were starting to get very adventurous. But then we discovered the brahmachari offering, or we invented it, because after lunch, there was nothing until hot milk at night, and we were hungry teenagers. A large pot of hot, sweet, buttery halva was now prepared by about 6 p.m. Devotees, especially the men, and especially me, would fill up their bowls. We used to have these big plastic bowls, sometimes with multiple servings, and we would end up sleeping through the rest of the program, sometimes on the very floor of the prasadam room itself. They'd make this huge pot of halva, oozing with butter and sugar, sometimes golden syrup and all sorts of things, the famous Australian food ingredient. And we'd have 2 or 3 bowls, and I can remember waking up at 9:30 at night on the floor of the prasadam room, drool coming out of my mouth, and everyone else had gone to bed, and it was all dark, and I'd slept through everything. Prabhupada had once quoted a common sense maxim. There are 2 mistakes one can make in eating, he said. One is to eat too much, and the other is to eat too little. If one has to make a mistake, Prabhupada said, it is better to make the mistake of eating too little. Krishna Prasadam, the remnants of the offerings to Krishna, was purifying, no doubt, but Prabhupada warned if one accepted prasadam only because of its palatable taste and ate too much, he would also fall prey to trying to satisfy the demands of the tongue. This in turn could lead to more serious difficulties. When Prabhupada heard of these new developments in Sydney, he was not impressed. In the afternoon, the message came back from Prabhupada, because Prabhupada was right there in Sydney, that the diet was too opulent. Someone had, as they say in Australia, dobbed us in. Prabhupada sent a message. Devotees should not eat such rich foodstuffs, he said, such just dal, rice, chapatis, and a little sabji, simple foods like that. We were attached, or I'll read what I wrote. The devotees were attached, I was attached, to their newfound sensory release. But since this order had come directly from Srila Prabhupada, they dutifully conceded to the culinary cutback. But it was sure nice while it lasted. Hot halva. But, my addiction to hot halva started then. Thursday, the 13th of April, 1972. It was Prabhupada's last day in Sydney. Off to New Zealand soon. The following day, he would fly to New Zealand. Prabhupada clearly recognized the great potential for spreading Krishna consciousness in Australia and was satisfied with the progress made so far. So remember, this was Prabhupada's second visit to Sydney. Prabhupada visited Sydney 3 times, and then he visited Melbourne 6 times. The previous day, he had told Satsvarupa Das Goswami in a letter, there is a very good scope, I'm still thinking of scoops of halva. There is very good scope this side for Sankirtan party. The Sydney and Melbourne people are doing especially nice, unquote. So yes, this chapter is called The Great Transcendental Adventure. So why did I call this chapter The Great Transcendental Adventure? Well, this is why. Prabhupada had often described the attempts of his young disciples to spread Krishna consciousness in the Western world as an adventure. He had written, the whole Vedic adventure is to draw one's attention entirely to the lotus feet of the Lord without any diversion. Such adventures, however, would not always be easy. Excuse me. Since, as he had written elsewhere, quote, all Western adventure is meant to keep people in darkness. And there was no denying that adventure meant taking risks. But as Prabhupada had noted in the Light of the Bhagavata, a nice book by Srila Prabhupada, taking risks in order to enlighten the fallen souls had many historical precedents. Here's a quote from the Light of the Bhagavata. Lord Jesus Christ, Thakur Haridas, Lord Nityananda Prabhu, and many such sages risked their lives to propagate the message of Godhead. Self-realized saints and sages took such risks for the spiritual enlightenment of the people in general. Such devotees were unafraid of the difficult journey to cross the ocean of nescience. They are always anxious for the welfare of the fallen souls who are attached to the false enjoyment of materialistic life, in which they forget their eternal relation with God. End of quote. Often Prabhupada's disciples would have to take chances and mix with materialistic people, endure harassment, like being thrown into jail, abuse, and even arrest. Prabhupada assured them, however, that Krishna personally appreciated the risk-taking of the devotees in a voluntary manner. Nobody is dearer to Krishna in human society. In fact, that's confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, 18th chapter. He said that there's no one more dear to me than he. Prabhupada had said, no one is dearer to Krishna in human society than the person who takes all risks for preaching God consciousness. Prabhupada had told Bali Madan that he was the pioneer. Now, Bali Madan, of course, came to Australia 2 years previously to this and established the Hare Krishna movement in Australia. Prabhupada was very happy, very pleased with Bali Madan, and he wrote to him in a letter that he was the pioneer in taking all risks in going to Australia and had assured him of success. Quote, "I take it for granted that you are one of the selected devotees of Lord Chaitanya, and therefore from within your heart he has inspired you to go to such a distant place, Australia, leaving your parents and home just to satisfy Krishna. This is the great transcendental adventure. Try your best, and I am sure that you will be successful." And indeed, he was. We were. Prabhupada's plans for his worldwide preaching movement were expansive. His program to open temples in all over the world was well underway. For Prabhupada, however, the word preaching had a much broader significance than mere sermonizing. Preaching meant glorious, selfless adventure on behalf of the Supreme Lord. He was convinced that the International Society for Krishna Consciousness's preaching would achieve what the League of Nations and the United Nations had failed to achieve: real unity and peace in the world. His young disciples in Australia, now numbering over 60, were thus real peace workers. By their endeavours, they were assisting Srila Prabhupada in bringing peace to a world deeply afflicted by materialism and strife. And guess what? So much materialism and strife continues in the world. So the preaching of Krishna consciousness must go on. By systematically propagating spiritual knowledge of the non-sectarian science of God to the people of Australia, these young boys and girls had embarked on a great transcendental adventure, transplanting the eternal preaching of Godhead known as Sankirtana from east to west. So that's the end of chapter 3. But I can't resist starting chapter 4. So I will. Chapter 4 out of 14 chapters. So we've got a little way to go. The Great Transcendental Adventure, Part 2. That's the name of the chapter. The Great Transcendental Adventure, Part 2, Auckland, 1972. So this is all about New Zealand. And for those of you that think Australia and New Zealand are the same place, no, they're not. Australia and New Zealand are very different, and you can't tell an Australian that Australia and New Zealand are pretty much the same, nor especially can you tell that to a New Zealander. Even though there's just a little bit of a space in the South Pacific between the two countries, there's a lot of difference. Chapter 4. I'll read you the first little section and then we'll continue next time. The Great Transcendental Adventure Part 2, Auckland, 1972. In New Zealand, we shall very soon have our own temple, Prabhupada wrote in a letter to Brahmananda. Tushta Krishna Das and his wife Krishna Tulsi were young, energetic American disciples of Srila Prabhupada. During their stay in Bombay in early January 1972, Tushta Krishna, that's not Pushta Krishna, there was Tushta Krishna and Pushta Krishna. Both of those Maharajas have passed away. But Tushta Krishna first conceived of the idea of opening an ISKCON centre in New Zealand. The couple, finding life in India very austere, asked Prabhupada's permission to go. Srila Prabhupada enthusiastically agreed and immediately gave them his blessings. He even intimated that he might visit Auckland after his Sydney visit. So that's a little taster of our next reading. Prabhupada's adventures in New Zealand. So stay tuned for part 2 of the Great Transcendental Adventure, Auckland, 1972. So we'll finish there. More nectar to come. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari. Thank you very much.